Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Hasselman, and in this lecture, we're going to be talking about Renaissance princes. So last time we talked about humanism, and now we're going to talk about some individuals during this time period. Now, the humanist emphasis on this world dovetailed nicely with the rise of a new kind of ruler who was ambitious, practical, and ruthless, typified by Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I of England, Louis XI, and Francis I of France, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and Ferdinand, Isabella, and Philip II of Spain. Now, after establishing their dynasties, these men and women sought greater control of their governments, reduced the power of the barons and legislative assemblies, secured greater authority over the religious lives of their subjects, and sought to pay for it all by claiming trade routes to the Far East and the Americas. Now, although we tend to think of medieval kings as powerful, in fact, their power was not absolute. The medieval king had to answer to or balance quite a few groups in the great chain of being. First, he was subordinate to God and his angels. All medieval commentators agree that the king's power came from God. This power was transmitted to the king through the church at his coronation, and theoretically, this power could be revoked through excommunication. The most famous and enduring statement limiting the power of a lay ruler, the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, was written by a bishop, Archbishop Stephen Langton. Popes might also claim to be at the top of the chain, as in the Vicar of Christ. Medieval kings created, enriched, and empowered nobles in order to have an army. But that meant that they created, enriched, and empowered a whole class of people who might rise up to challenge them. Now, these so-called nobles often used their lands and their wealth they produced to build up independent power bases, hence the modern usage of the term feudal and fiefdom. They used their armies not necessarily to defend kings or maintain peace, so much as to attack local towns or even the king himself, as we see in the 100 Years' War that ran from 1337 to 1456, in which a series of weak kings were taken advantage by their vassals. The fight the barons kings needed to hire mercenary armies, that is, armies paid occasionally rather than endowed with land permanently, as in feudalism. At first, kings allied with towns and their merchants in return for loans and taxes. Kings gave towns military protection and rights to hold markets or establish legal courts. Now, eventually, it became too cumbersome to summon delegations of merchants to court and to explain the king's difficulty on an ad hoc basis. In the 13th and 14th centuries, European kings began to institutionalize their meetings with both barons and townsmen. In England, these meetings came to be known as Parliament. In France, they were called the Estates General. In Castile, Spain, they were called the Cortes. And in the Holy Roman Empire, they were called the Diet. But only in England and Spain did the tradition develop that laws and taxes had to be approved by these bodies. Ordinary people owed loyalty, obedience, and taxes to a wide variety of persons and institutions: the church, the nobility, and their town, if townsmen, as well as to the king. As Europe approached the year 1500, all this began to change. A series of new, stronger monarchs arose whose goal were to end baronial rebellions and make themselves more secure and ultimately absolute. Inadvertently, these monarchs would establish the modern conception of a nation-state. Now, Renaissance princes may be divided into two groups: the founders of these dynasties and their successors. All across Western Europe, new dynasties emerged from out of the carnage of baronial and civil war. In England, first the Yorkists, then the Tudors under Henry VII, established their dynasties after the War of the Roses. In France, the Valois re-established themselves after the 100 Years' War under Charles VII and Louis XI. In the Holy Roman Empire, Habsburg power revived under Maximilian I, and Spain was united by the 1469 marriage of Isabella of Castile and Léon de Ferdinand of Aragon, who after suppressing 10 years of rebellion became joint rulers of Spain in 1479. Isabella predeceased Ferdinand, who ruled until 1516. Portugal was united under the House of Aviz. In Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, or Matthias the Just, ruled from 1458 to 1490. And the goal of these rulers was to establish, or in France and the Holy Roman Empire, to re-establish their lines and put down baronial opposition. The rulers made strategic marriages to heal wounds within the country and gained friends for it. They ruthlessly suppressed baronial and private armies. They allied with cities for loans and money and were careful to hire educated Renaissance lawyers and merchants, as well as nobles as counselors and officials. They worked with established assemblies such as Parliament, the Cortes, and so on. And the rulers maintained good relations with the church, in part by persecuting heretics enthusiastically. They drove out foreign invaders, consolidated holdings, and imposed religious uniformity. They reformed their governments and legal systems to be more efficient in order to have more control of the localities, as in the Edict of Montalvo in Spain. And in keeping with the Renaissance, these princes had a healthy respect for education, the arts, and propaganda. Now, these rulers laid the groundwork for a series of powerful successors who inherited and exploited the foundation laid by the previous generation. The most notable of these successors included Henry VIII and Elizabeth I in England, Francis I and Henry II in France, Charles V in the Holy Roman Empire, who also served as Charles I in Spain, father of Philip II of Spain. Even more than their predecessors, these monarchs had terrific humanistic educations. Charles V was tutored by the future Pope Adrian VI, Elizabeth I by famed education reformer Roger Ascham, and Francis I by Christophe de Longueuil. Now, their policies were a mixture of old and new. All these rulers contained the programs of suppression of elite, power, and heretical groups, strategic marriages, and administrative reforms. But these rulers also changed policies of consolidation into expansion. The Holy Roman Emperor and the kings of France, culminating in Charles V and Francis I, vied for control of Italy through the 1520s. Henry VIII attempted invasions of Scotland and France in 1513 to 15 and 1544 to 47. Spain expanded overseas in the New World, faced down an Islamic challenge in the Mediterranean by defeating a Turkish fleet in Lepanto in 1571, conquered most of Italy, annexed Portugal when the Portuguese royal house died out in 1580, and dabbled in the politics of England and France. Now, in terms of religion, these rulers sometimes sought to dominate the church as well as the state. The classical example is Henry VIII breaking with Rome and making himself head of the Church of England in 1534. In 1516, Francis I used his military power in Italy to secure the right to appoint all bishops and abbots in France. Charles V made war on recalcitrant Protestant barons and towns in the War of the Schmalkaldic League. And as Charles I of Spain, he gained complete control over church appointments. Now, Renaissance kings, who, as we're talking about, were obsessed with projecting their power through propaganda and by commissioning buildings, poems, paintings, and so on. Henry VIII confiscated the rebuilt Hampton Court and Whitehall, patronized the great portraitist Hans Holbein, and employed a stable of writers to support his royal supremacy. Charles V employed painters like Titian. Francis I built the Louvre and the castle and hunting lodge at Chambord, possibly originally laid out by Leonardo da Vinci. He turned Castle Fontainebleau into a major palace, commissioning great architects as Giacomo di Vignola and artists of the day, Rosso Fiontorino, Andrea del Sarto, and Cellini. In reforming their governments, stamping out opposition, and taking control of the arts and even their religion, the princes of the Renaissance redefined loyalty as owed to them alone. In 1536, Catholic peasants in northern England rebelled against Henry VIII's break from Rome and were suppressed ruthlessly. The Jews and the Moors of Spain and the nobles of French Brittany all learned the same lesson. Charles V's failure to stamp out Protestantism at the end of the War of the Schmalkaldic League is the exception that proves the rule. The Holy Roman Empire remained divided in religion and decentralized in authority. The result was a power vacuum in the middle of Europe. So why did other rulers succeed in creating strong nation-states where the Holy Roman Emperor failed? It could be argued that the empire suffered from more religious disunity following the Reformation than did the other regimes noted above, or earlier. The second factor was money. Rulers needed money to build palaces, commission propaganda, and raise armies to suppress rebellions and project their power abroad. Where were the rulers going to get this money? They could raise taxes, but medieval rulers won support from nobles in the church by exempting them from taxation. That left peasants, who did not have any money, and towns, which did. But overtaxing towns would kill the economy. Moreover, the need to institutionalize the raising of money had led to the rise of representative assemblies, parliaments, diets, estates, and so on, that might question royal policy. Was there no other source of ready money available to European rulers? The Italian city-states had grown wealthy on trade from the east, leading every major power, except England, to try to control Italy. Henry VIII, having taken over the Church of England, confiscated much of its land. Anates, or taxes paid to the Pope, in 1534, smaller monasteries in 1536, larger monasteries in 1539, and hospitals and other charitable foundations in 1547. Instead of using those lands to endow the monarchy for centuries, Henry then traded long-term security for quick cash by selling these lands to the nobles and gentry. Now, beginning with Louis XII, the kings of France sold government offices. While raising cash quickly and stimulating social mobility, this also expanded the size of government and based service on wealth, not merit. The Portuguese prince, Henry the Navigator, had a different idea. He planned to bypass the Italians and go directly to the source, trading with China and India themselves.